CNN reporter asked in astonishment, "President Traoré, you say you have documents proving what you call the West's shadow policy. This is a very serious claim. What kind of documents are we talking about?" Ibrahim Traoré was making a statement to the world on live television. He showed the file he was holding. "This is evidence of the secret policies implemented by France, the USA, and other Western powers since African countries gained independence. Here are separate plans for each country: how to manipulate democratic elections, how to control natural resources, which leaders to support and which to overthrow." The reporter looked even more surprised. "How can we verify that these documents are genuine?" Traoré smiled. "Because the people who wrote them are now denying the authenticity of the documents. But it's too late. Africa is awakening." While the live broadcast continued, millions of viewers worldwide were watching in amazement as the young leader of Burkina Faso made his bold revelations. Traoré continued to show the documents to the camera one by one. "Look, this document is dated 1973, he said, turning the pages. "It's called the African Strategic Resources Protection Doctrine. Among the signatories are the heads of the French, American, and British intelligence services of that time. This document details how strategic mines in newly independent African countries, gold, uranium, diamonds, cobalt, would be controlled." CNN reporter Sarah Wilson, still in shock, continued her questions. "President Traoré, how did these documents reach you?" Traoré paused for a moment, then answered, "A former French intelligence officer, Claude Dubois, delivered these documents to us. He worked in the French DGSE, External Intelligence Service, for 40 years, spending his last 15 years at the Africa desk. His conscience could no longer bear this secret, and he decided to share the truth with the world." Where is Claude Dubois now? "For security reasons, I cannot share this information. However, he is safe and ready to tell the truth." As the broadcast continued, alarm bells were ringing in diplomatic and intelligence circles in Paris, Washington, and London. The French Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued an urgent statement: "We categorically reject the claims of the president of Burkina Faso. The mentioned documents are fake and have been produced to defame France's Africa policy." Traoré smiled when he heard this statement. "I knew they would say this." However, the signatures and seals on the documents have been examined by international document experts. They are all genuine. Plus, we have Claude Dubois's testimony. The CNN reporter wanted to delve deeper into the subject. "President Traoré, is there a particular example in these documents that you find especially striking?" "Of course," said Traoré, opening another file. "This document contains the plan for military coups in West Africa in 1983. Look, here is a plan regarding the overthrow of Thomas Sankara. Sankara, the revolutionary leader of our country, was killed in a coup in 1987. These documents show that the coup was planned and financed by French intelligence." Traoré's statements resonated greatly in Burkina Faso and throughout Africa. Just hours after the documents were published, thousands of people began to gather in the streets of Ouagadougou. Protesters were chanting slogans such as "True Freedom Now" and "End Western Exploitation." Meanwhile, crisis meetings were being held in Western capitals. In Paris, the French president gathered his emergency cabinet. In Washington, the National Security Council convened in an extraordinary session. "This is a disaster," said the French foreign minister in a closed meeting. "We need to quickly determine whether the documents are genuine or skillfully prepared fakes." "Whether they're genuine or not doesn't matter anymore," replied the intelligence chief. "Perception is more important than reality. African public opinion believes this, and it jeopardizes all our influence on the continent." The next day, Ibrahim Traoré made a new statement, this time on Burkina Faso national television. Beside him was an elderly European man with white hair. "People of Burkina Faso and the entire world. The person you see beside me is Claude Dubois, a former agent who worked in the French External Intelligence Service from 1975 to 2015. He describes his decision to share these documents with us as a moral responsibility." Claude Dubois looked at the camera, his voice trembling. "Yes, my name is Claude Dubois. I worked in French intelligence for 40 years, and during this time, I personally witnessed how Africa policy was shaped. I made the decision to share these documents by listening to my conscience. The truth needs to be known now." "Why now?" asked the Burkina journalist. "Because the world is changing," Dubois replied. "African countries are now demanding true independence. And I believe that the sins of the past must be confessed. This is the first step towards healing and progress." Dubois revealed more than the documents Traoré had shown yesterday. A series of secret plans, protocols, and operation details spanning from the 1960s to the 2010s. Each contained strategies aimed at controlling Africa's economic and political structure from outside. The most striking revelation was a plan called the African Resources Control Mechanism. This plan detailed how the natural resources of African countries would remain under the control of Western companies even after they gained independence. The plan included strategies such as political destabilization, economic pressure, and military intervention when necessary. "Look, here are the real reasons for the 2011 Libya intervention," said Dubois, showing another document. The real reason behind Gaddafi's overthrow was his plan to create a pan-African currency. This would eliminate the West's ability to control the African economy. After the interview was broadcast, international reactions quickly intensified. The African Union called for an urgent meeting. Leaders of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, gathered to discuss the matter. Leaders of West African countries such as Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad issued messages of support to Traoré. The president of Mali said, "These documents confirm what we have suspected for years. Our independence was an illusion." The Western world, however, continued to deny the allegations. The French Foreign Ministry spokesperson claimed in a press conference, "We don't have a former agent named Claude Dubois. This person is an imposter, and his documents are fake." However, international news agencies such as Reuters and Associated Press confirmed Dubois's identity. Photos and records in French intelligence archives showed that he was indeed who he claimed to be. 3 days later, Ibrahim Traoré held an international press conference. This time, he not only showed the documents but also shared their digital copies with the world media. "Now everyone can see the truth," said Traoré. "These documents explain why Africa is still poor. Our resources are rich, our people are hardworking, but our revenues flow to the West. Why? Because colonialism never really ended, it just changed form." After the press conference, Traoré, together with Claude Dubois, launched a website containing all the documents, africatruth.org. The site included originals and translations of all documents, each presented with detailed explanations. The site attracted millions of visitors within hours and went viral throughout Africa. The hashtag #AfricaTruth became a trend across the continent. Meanwhile, Western intelligence services were making intense efforts to find Claude Dubois. However, the Burkina Faso government had placed him under protection. Dubois was being kept in a secure location, with constant protection. A week later, France's stance began to change. Instead of claiming that the documents were completely fake, they now said they were taken out of context and misinterpreted. "Of course we have an Africa policy," said the French president in a national television address. However, this is a policy that has developed based on our historical ties and economic partnership. The colonial era is over, and we accept that. But it was already too late. African public opinion had awakened. Across the continent, protests were organized at facilities owned by French and other Western companies. In some countries, governments began to review mining licenses of Western companies. Ibrahim Traoré decided to maximize the benefit from the situation. Traoré sent a letter to the African Union, proposing a document he called the African Resources Independence Declaration. This declaration envisaged African countries taking full control of their natural resources and renegotiating agreements with former colonial powers. The African Union organized an extraordinary summit to discuss the document. The summit was held in Addis Ababa, and 48 of Africa's 54 countries attended, a record attendance. Speaking at the opening of the summit, Traoré said, "Today is Africa's true Independence Day. No more secrets, no more shadow policies. We will determine our own destiny." After 3 days of negotiations, the African Union adopted the African Resources Independence Declaration. The declaration recognized the right of all African countries to take full control of their natural resources and renegotiate economic agreements with former colonial powers. The most striking article of the declaration was the establishment of a neo-colonial compensation fund. This fund envisaged Western powers making payments as a price for exploiting Africa's resources. These developments caused panic in Western capitals. Economic analysts predicted that restricting access to Africa's mineral resources could have profound effects on Western economies. Africa provides 70% of the world's cobalt production, 40% of the platinum group, 60% of diamonds, and 20% of gold, an economist explained to CNN. If access to these minerals is restricted, many industries from electronic devices to automobiles will be affected. A month after the African Union summit, the first concrete steps began to be taken. Ghana decided to nationalize its gold mines. Mali terminated its agreements with French uranium companies. Niger began to renegotiate uranium prices. In Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, all gold and manganese mines were taken under state control. licenses belonging to French companies were cancelled. Western powers tried to respond with economic sanctions, but this time there was a different dynamic. African countries were united. When sanctions were applied to one country, others showed solidarity. Additionally, alternative partners such as China and Russia were also ready. Claude Dubois was closely following these developments. He was living in a secure house in Burkina Faso, under Traoré's protection. Occasionally, he made statements on television, detailing his revelations. In one interview, he said, "Seeing Africa's awakening is the most meaningful experience of my life. For 40 years, I was part of a system, and now I am helping to dismantle that system. This is a kind of atonement." 6 months later, Ibrahim Traoré gave a speech at the United Nations General Assembly. In his speech, he presented a report titled The West's Debt to Africa. The report calculated the value of resources extracted from Africa since the colonial period and showed that it amounted to trillions of dollars in today's value. "Now is the time for justice," said Traoré. "The West has a debt to Africa, and this debt needs to be paid." The speech was met with long applause at the UN General Assembly. Delegates from African, Asian, and Latin American countries gave a standing ovation. Meanwhile, in the Western world, public opinion had also begun to change. Claude Dubois's revelations and Traoré's efforts had mobilized activists and intellectuals in the West. In universities, courses were being given on the history of Africa's exploitation. In the streets, demonstrations were being organized with slogans of justice for Africa. As pressure increased, Western governments also began to change their stance. The French president made a historic speech, saying, "We accept the mistakes of the colonial era and want to open a new page with Africa." The United States started a program called the Africa Development Fund. The fund provided low-interest loans and technology transfer to African countries. However, Ibrahim Traoré and other African leaders described these initiatives as insufficient. "We don't want charity," said Traoré. "We want justice. We want a fair sharing of resources." A year later, at the World Economic Forum, Africa's economic transformation was the main topic. According to the report, African countries had recorded an average GDP growth of 8% in the last year, thanks to the increase in mining revenues. The new economic approach, called the African model, was being discussed worldwide. This model was based on full control of natural resources, technology transfer, and regional cooperation. Ibrahim Traoré had gained international fame as one of the architects of this model. Time magazine selected him as Person of the Year. On the cover, he was posing with a file of documents in his hand, and the title read, "Africa's Liberator." Claude Dubois compiled his memoirs in a book, From Intelligence Service to Whistleblower, The Story of Africa's Exploitation. The book was translated into many languages worldwide and appeared on bestseller lists in many countries. Today, Ibrahim Traoré is leading Burkina Faso's economic transformation. The country's gold revenues are now being used for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects. The unemployment rate is decreasing, and living standards are rising. But perhaps most importantly, there's a change in the eyes of the people of Burkina Faso. Now there is hope, pride, and a vision for the future. In an interview, Traoré said, "We revealed the West's biggest secret, and this was just the beginning. Real change is starting now. Africa's potential is limitless, and we are finally realizing this potential." In his last interview, Claude Dubois said, "If I have been able to somewhat compensate for the wrongs I did in the last years of my life, it was worth it. Seeing Africa's awakening was my greatest wish, and I managed to see it." Today, in the streets of Ouagadougou stands the monument of revealing the truth. The monument depicts the moment Ibrahim Traoré receives the documents from Claude Dubois. At the base of the monument, these words are written, "Truth is the most powerful weapon." And this weapon has forever changed the destiny of Africa.